Picture this, June 19th, 1947. Over 3,000 people packed into a massive Chicago factory, waiting for the unveiling of what promised to be the car of the future. The champagne bottle arcs through the air, smashes against the chrome headlight, and suddenly Preston Tucker is drenched. Champagne sprays everywhere, soaking not just Tucker, but the half-dozen engineers still covered in grease from frantically trying to make the damn thing run. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Just 2 hours earlier, the transmission had locked up completely. The experimental engine was so loud it could deafen a crowd. 2 suspension arms snapped under the car's own weight. While 3,000 investors and journalists waited for lunch and a show, engineers worked in absolute panic behind the scenes. They had literally been pushing the car by hand onto the rotating platform moments before Tucker's daughter christened it with that ill-fated champagne bottle. But here's the thing that makes this story incredible. This catastrophic unveiling wasn't the worst thing that would happen to Preston Tucker. Not even close. Because what came next was a conspiracy so vast, so calculated, that it would involve a United States senator, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the most powerful automakers in the world, and a coordinated campaign of destruction that would make modern corporate warfare look like playground politics. Tucker's crime? He dared to build a car that was actually safe. A car with innovations that wouldn't become standard until the 1980s. A car so revolutionary that Detroit's Big Three had to destroy him before he destroyed their entire business model. And the craziest part? After everything they threw at him, after they crushed his company and put him on trial for fraud, he was completely acquitted. Every single charge. Not guilty. The court said he'd done nothing wrong. But by then, it was too late. His dream was already dead. So here's the question that'll drive this whole story. If Preston Tucker was innocent, why did the most powerful people in America work so hard to destroy him? Before we dive into this rabbit hole, if you're into stories about the geniuses and dreamers who got crushed by the establishment, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments if you've ever seen a Tucker automobile in person, because there's only 51 of them in the entire world, and they're worth over $3 million each today. That's not a typo. $3 million, for a car that supposedly nobody wanted. Now, to understand what happened to Tucker, you need to understand post-war America in 1946. World War II had just ended. Americans had spent 4 years building tanks and bombers instead of cars. The automotive industry had been completely frozen. Nobody could buy a new car from 1942 to 1945. So by 1946, there were millions of Americans desperate for new vehicles, sitting on wartime savings with nothing to spend it on. Think of it like the early days of the internet, when everyone suddenly needed a computer and there weren't enough to go around. Except instead of computers, it was cars. And instead of Silicon Valley startups competing, you had 3 massive corporations who'd made a pact. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. The Big Three. They controlled everything. Every steel mill, every parts supplier, every dealership, every political connection. These weren't just car companies. They were the American economy. General Motors alone was bigger than most countries. Their CEO, Charles Wilson, would famously say, "What's good for General Motors is good for America," a few years later. That wasn't corporate spin. That was how people actually thought. The Big Three had spent the war building Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers. They'd learned how to produce on a scale that would have been unimaginable in 1941. And now they were going to use that same industrial might to dominate the automotive market forever. Their strategy was simple. Build the same basic car designs they'd had in 1941, make a few cosmetic changes, and sell them at massive markups to a desperate public. Innovation. That was dangerous. Safety features. Too expensive. New technology? Why bother when customers would buy whatever you gave them? Britain had already locked down its market. Germany and Japan were rebuilding from rubble. The American automotive industry was a closed club, and they planned to keep it that way. Anyone who tried to break in would be crushed, not competed with. Crushed. And Preston Tucker was about to walk right into their crosshairs, carrying a car that made their entire product line look like death traps from the Stone Age. Preston Thomas Tucker was born September 21st, 1903, on a peppermint farm in Capac, Michigan. His father, Shirl Harvey Tucker, was a railroad engineer. Notice I said was. When Preston was 3 years old, his father was killed in a railroad accident. The details are murky, but what we know is this: a massive corporation, poor safety standards, and a man who never came home. His mother, Lucille, was a school teacher. She raised Preston alone during a time when being a single mother meant poverty and social stigation. They were poor, not struggling poor. The kind of poor where you understand from childhood that the world is divided into people who have power and people who get crushed by it. Preston never forgot that. His father died because a railroad company valued profits over safety. That fact burned into him like a brand. At 13 years old, Preston got a job as an office boy at the Cadillac division of General Motors. This wasn't some nice mentorship program. This was child labor in the early 1900s, when factories were about as safe as active minefields. He saw how cars were built. More importantly, he saw how auto workers were treated. 16-hour shifts, missing fingers from stamping presses, industrial accidents that management covered up to avoid liability. But Tucker loved cars. He loved the idea of them, the potential of them. What drove him crazy was how badly they were made. Cars in the 1910s and 20s were basically metal boxes on wheels. No safety features, no crumple zones. In a serious accident, the steering column would go straight through your chest. The windshield would explode into your face. The rigid frame would transfer all impact energy directly into your body. Tucker dropped out of Cass Technical High School in Detroit. He briefly worked as a police officer in Lincoln Park, Michigan, from 1918 to 1920. Imagine that, a teenage cop seeing accident after accident, people dying in crashes that should have been survivable. Every mangled body, every family destroyed, all because car companies refused to spend an extra $50 on safety features. By his 20s, Tucker was selling cars for Studebaker, Stutz, and Chrysler. He was good at it, really good. He could sell ice to people in igloos. But the whole time he was selling these death traps, he was thinking, there has to be a better way. Cars don't have to kill people. We have the technology. We have the knowledge. We're just choosing not to use it because it might cut into profit margins. In 1935, Tucker partnered with Harry Miller, a legendary race car engine designer. They formed Miller Tucker Incorporated. Miller had designed engines for Indianapolis 500 winners. He understood performance, but more importantly, he understood how to make engines that could take punishment and keep running. Tucker learned everything Miller knew about high-performance engineering. Then World War II happened, and this is where Tucker's story gets really interesting. In 1941, Tucker designed something called the Tucker turret. It was a gun turret for military aircraft that rotated faster and more smoothly than anything else on the market. The military bought it. Tucker became a defense contractor, making components that helped kill enemy pilots. His factory workers built instruments of death, while Tucker dreamed about building instruments of safety. Think about that irony. Tucker's turrets were saving American bomber crews by helping them kill more efficiently. Meanwhile, more Americans were dying in car accidents on American roads than were dying in combat overseas. But the military paid top dollar for innovation in weapons, while car companies fought against innovation in vehicles. By 1945, when the war ended, Tucker had made serious money from his defense contracts. He'd also developed connections in Washington and learned how to navigate government bureaucracy. But what nobody knew was that this guy was about to take every penny he'd made from war and bet it all on a dream that would make him enemy number one for the most powerful corporations in America. In 1946, Preston Tucker announced he was going to build a car. Not just any car. The car of tomorrow. Today. A sedan so advanced it would make every vehicle on American roads look like Victorian-era horse carriages. Here's what Tucker promised. A rear-mounted engine, like the Volkswagen Beetle, but more powerful. Four-wheel independent suspension with rubber torsion bars. A safety windshield that would pop out during crashes instead of turning into flying daggers. A padded dashboard. Disc brakes. Fuel injection. A torque converter automatic transmission. Safety features that wouldn't become standard until the 1980s. But the feature that really captured public imagination was the Cyclops eye, a center-mounted headlight that turned with the steering wheel. When you went around curves at night, the light would point where you were actually going instead of straight ahead. It sounds obvious, right? Except it was so far ahead of its time that 17 states immediately made it illegal. Today, we call these adaptive headlights, and they're considered cutting-edge technology in 2025 luxury cars. Tucker needed money, and he needed it fast. So he came up with a financing scheme that was either brilliant or borderline fraudulent, depending on who you ask. He started selling Tucker dealership franchises before he had a working car. For $5, anyone could become a Tucker dealer. For larger amounts, you could get exclusive territories. Think of it like buying into a franchise for a restaurant chain that hasn't opened a single location yet. Thousands of Americans sent money. Tucker raised $6 million this way. In 1947 dollars, that's equivalent to about $85 million today. But Tucker still needed a factory, and this is where his military connections paid off. The War Assets Administration had surplus factories all over America. These were massive industrial plants built for wartime production that the government was now selling off cheap. Tucker wanted a steel mill. With vertical integration, he could control his supply chain and undercut the big three on price. Enter Senator Homer Ferguson, Republican from Michigan, known as the Senator from Detroit, or sometimes the Senator from General Motors. Ferguson had been a judge before entering the Senate in 1943. He had deep connections to Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, and he absolutely hated Preston Tucker. Every time Tucker bid on a War Assets Administration facility, Ferguson blocked it, used his political influence to make sure those steel mills went to anyone except Tucker. The official reason? Tucker was inexperienced, unproven, a risk to national economic recovery. The real reason? The Big Three had told Ferguson to kill Tucker's supply chain before Tucker became a threat. So Tucker pivoted. He leased the Dodge Chicago plant. This was a massive facility, 475 acres of industrial space where Dodge had built B-29 bomber engines during the war. It was perfect. Well, perfect except for one problem. It was completely empty. No machinery, no tools, no assembly lines. Tucker would have to build everything from scratch. Now he needed to actually design the car. Problem: he didn't have a chief designer. He'd been working with a few people, but nobody who could take this from concept to production. And his deadline for the prototype unveiling was January 1st, 1947. That was the date he'd promised investors they'd see a working car. On Christmas Eve, 1946, with 6 days until his deadline, Tucker hired Alex Tremulis as chief designer. Tremulis had worked for Auburn Cord Duesenberg, designing some of the most beautiful cars of the 1930s. He was talented, but he was also being given an impossible task: design an entire car in 6 days, when normal automotive design took 3 years. Tremulous worked Christmas Day. He worked New Year's Eve. He slept maybe 4 hours total that week. There was no time for clay mock-ups, which was standard procedure for car design. Tremulous drew sketches, and sheet metal workers hammered the body panels by hand, making it up as they went along. And here's the dark secret that Tucker would take to his grave. He knew the January deadline was impossible. He knew the car wouldn't be ready, but he'd already sold those dealerships, already taken that money, already made promises to 44,000 investors who'd bought stock. If he admitted the car wasn't ready, the whole house of cards would collapse. So he decided to fake it and hope the engineers could pull off a miracle. Tucker's engine was the most audacious part of the whole design. He didn't want to build a conventional car engine. Why would he? Conventional engines were heavy, inefficient, and had been basically the same design since the Model T. Tucker wanted something revolutionary, so he decided to use a helicopter engine. Specifically, a modified Franklin 0335 air-cooled helicopter engine. This thing was originally designed for aircraft, so it was light, powerful, and built to incredibly tight tolerances. The idea was to mount it in the rear of the car, which would give better weight distribution and more trunk space in the front. Think of this like trying to put a jet engine in a skateboard. Yeah, it'll go fast, but you're going to have some serious adaptation problems. The Franklin engine was designed to run at high altitude with freezing air rushing past it. In a car closed in an engine compartment, in summer traffic, different story. The engine Tucker planned to use was a 589 cubic inch monster. For context, modern cars usually have engines between 150 and 300 cubic inches. This was nearly 600. It produced about 166 horsepower, which doesn't sound impressive now, but in 1947, when most cars made 60 to 80 horsepower, this was a rocket ship. But there were problems, big problems. First, the engine was loud. Not regular car loud, helicopter loud. Like standing next to a lawnmower, loud. Because it was air-cooled, it needed massive fins and cooling fans, which created a sound like a mechanical banshee. Engineers tried everything to quiet it down, but nothing worked. You couldn't have a conversation in the car with this thing running. Second, the engine ran hot. Really hot. Without the natural airflow from flying through the sky, the air-cooled design was cooking itself. They had to add extra cooling ducts, more fans, bigger grills. The elegant rear-end design that Tremulous had drawn got carved up with vents and scoops. Third, and this is the killer, the engine was unreliable. Aircraft engines are designed for specific service intervals. They're built to run for a certain number of hours. Then they're completely torn down and rebuilt by trained mechanics. Tucker was trying to turn this into a consumer car engine that housewives would drive to the grocery store. The tolerances were too tight. Parts would seize up. The engine would overheat and lock. Now here's where Tucker's salesman instincts kicked in. He knew the engine was problematic, but he also knew he couldn't admit that to investors. So when he demonstrated the car, he used external tricks. High-voltage starters that would get the engine going with an impressive roar. But once you shut it off, you couldn't restart it without the special equipment. It was automotive theater, not engineering. Meanwhile, the suspension was its own disaster. Tucker had designed a 4-wheel independent rubber torsion suspension. The idea was brilliant. Instead of traditional metal springs, use rubber torsion bars that would compress and rebound. This gave an incredibly smooth ride, absorbing bumps that would rattle your teeth in a normal car. But rubber has a problem. It tears. Under the weight of the Tucker prototype, which was coming in way heavier than design specifications, the rubber torsion bars kept snapping. Engineers would hear a loud crack and watch the car list to one side as a suspension arm gave way. They'd replace it, drive another 20 miles, and it would snap again. By early 1947, Tucker was burning through money like gasoline in his prototype. He'd raised $6 million from dealerships, but that was evaporating. The factory needed machinery. Workers needed paychecks. Materials cost money. And the big three were starting to notice him. This is when the supplier pressure began. Tucker needed parts, specific parts, brake components, electrical systems, chrome trim, glass, rubber seals. He couldn't make everything in-house, so he'd call suppliers, and they'd quote him prices. Then, mysteriously, those quotes would disappear. Suppliers would call back, "Sorry, Mr. Tucker, we can't supply you after all." When Tucker pushed for reasons, he'd get vague answers. Capacity issues, prior commitments, corporate policy. What Tucker didn't know was that General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were making calls of their own to those same suppliers. The message was simple: sell to Tucker and lose our business. And since the big three represented 90+% of the American automotive market, that was an existential threat. Of course, suppliers chose the big three over Tucker, and that's when Tucker realized something terrifying. He wasn't just competing with other car companies. He was fighting the entire American automotive industrial complex, and it was becoming very clear that this fight was rigged from the start. June 19th, 1947. Tucker had been promising a working prototype to investors for 6 months. The pressure was unbearable. He'd hired 1,900 workers, sold 2,000 dealerships, raised millions in investment, and the car barely ran. But Tucker was a showman, so he planned the biggest automotive unveiling in American history. He invited 3,000 people to the Dodge Chicago plant for a full production. Lunch, speeches, entertainment, and the grand reveal of the Tucker 48, which journalists were already calling the Tin Goose. The morning of June 19th was chaos. The prototype transmission locked up during final testing just completely froze. Engineers tried everything: disassembly, lubrication, gentle persuasion with large hammers. Nothing worked. The car wouldn't move under its own power. The suspension arms, those rubber torsion bars I mentioned, 2 of them snapped during the dress rehearsal. The car sat there, literally sagging to one side like a wounded animal. And that aircraft engine? It was so loud that running it in the enclosed factory space would have been like setting off a bomb. The sound would echo off concrete walls and deafen everyone in attendance. Engineers did a test run and immediately shut it down. This wasn't going to work. Tucker had a choice: cancel the event and admit failure, or improvise. Being Tucker, he improvised. 3,000 people showed up for lunch. Tucker kept them entertained for 2 hours. Just 2 solid hours of speeches, demonstrations, testimonials. Anything to buy time. Behind the scenes, grease-covered engineers worked in absolute panic. They couldn't fix the transmission, couldn't fix the suspension, couldn't quiet the engine. Finally, someone came up with a solution. They'd push the car onto a rotating platform. Just push it, by hand, like moving furniture. They'd position it perfectly, make sure it looked good under the lights, and pray nobody asked for a demonstration drive. The curtains opened. The audience gasped, because even sitting still, the Tucker looked incredible. Sleek, futuristic, like nothing else on American roads. The center Cyclops Eye headlight gleamed. The curved fenders suggested speed, even when parked. This was a car from the future, and everyone in that room knew it. Then came the christening. Tucker's daughter stepped up with a champagne bottle to smash against the Cyclops Eye headlight in traditional ship-launching fashion. She swung, connected perfectly, and champagne exploded everywhere. All over the headlight, all over the engineers still covered in grease from their frantic repairs, all over Preston Tucker himself, who stood there dripping champagne and motor oil, while 3,000 people applauded. The photos from that day show Tucker with the biggest smile you've ever seen, soaking wet, surrounded by a car that couldn't move. That's the Preston Tucker story in one image. Absolute disaster portrayed as complete triumph. Now, did the audience know the car didn't work? Some of them must have suspected. But Tucker's enthusiasm was so infectious, his vision so compelling, that it almost didn't matter. People wanted to believe. America in 1947 wanted to believe that someone could challenge Detroit, that innovation was possible, that the future could be better than the past. After the event, newspapers ran headlines about the revolutionary Tucker automobile. Some were skeptical, pointing out that no one had actually seen the car drive. But others were enthusiastic, describing it as the car that would change everything. What none of them knew was that this unveiling had been a calculated performance. The car worked, barely, in controlled conditions, but it was nowhere near production ready. The engine needed complete redesign. The transmission needed complete redesign. The suspension needed complete redesign. Tucker was maybe 20% of the way to having a saleable product, but he'd just sold the public on a car that was 100% ready, and the clock was ticking, because the Securities and Exchange Commission had just opened a file on Tucker Corporation. Someone in Detroit had made a phone call. The conspiracy to destroy Preston Tucker was officially underway. After the Tin Goose unveiling, Tucker had a serious problem. He'd shown the public a car that didn't work, and now he needed money to actually make it work. The dealership franchise money was gone. The factory was burning through cash. Workers needed to be paid. Engineers needed resources. Tucker's solution was to start selling stock in Tucker Corporation, but not through normal channels. He created what was essentially a direct-to-consumer stock offering. Anyone could buy shares in the future of American automotive innovation. The pitch was simple. Get in on the ground floor of the company that's going to revolutionize transportation. 44,000 Americans bought stock. That number is staggering. 44,000 people, most of them regular working-class families, invested their savings in Preston Tucker's dream. These weren't millionaires or venture capitalists. These were teachers, factory workers, shopkeepers, veterans who'd just come home from the war and wanted to be part of building a better America. Tucker raised millions this way. Some accounts say the total was over $20 million in 1947 money. That's roughly $300 million in today's dollars. And here's the thing. Most of that money went into actually trying to build the car. Tucker wasn't buying yachts or mansions. He was genuinely trying to make this work, but he was also making promises he couldn't keep. Then came the accessory scheme, and this is where things get legally questionable. Tucker had a brilliant idea. Why wait until the car is finished to start selling Tucker-branded products? He created a whole line of accessories. Tucker radios, Tucker seat covers, Tucker luggage racks, Tucker floor mats. The sales pitch was perfect. Get your Tucker accessories now, so they're ready when your Tucker automobile arrives. Thousands of people bought these accessories, for cars that didn't exist, for cars that might never exist. Tucker raised another $2 million from the accessory program. Now you might be thinking, that's fraud. Selling accessories for cars you haven't built? And the Securities and Exchange Commission thought the same thing. They started investigating Tucker in late 1947. The question was simple. Was Tucker running a legitimate automotive startup? Or was this an elaborate con game? Here's where it gets complicated. Tucker genuinely believed he could build the car. He had engineers working around the clock. He had a factory. He had suppliers, or at least he was trying to get suppliers despite Big Three interference. The accessories were real products. The stock certificates were real stock. Nothing was technically fraudulent. But Tucker was also overpromising, telling investors the car would be in production by mid-1948 when he knew that was impossible, claiming the car was essentially finished when major components needed complete redesign. Using money from new stock sales to pay expenses from previous commitments, which looked suspiciously like a pyramid scheme. Meanwhile, back in the factory, Alex Tremulous and his team were trying to turn the Tin Goose into an actual production vehicle. They ditched the helicopter engine. Too loud, too unreliable, too expensive. They found a more conventional engine, the Tucker 448. This was a flat-six engine, still rear-mounted, but designed for automotive use. The new engine was better, but it brought new problems. Cooling was still an issue. The transmission still needed work. The rubber torsion suspension kept breaking. Every time they fixed one problem, 3 more appeared. This is normal in automotive development, but Tucker didn't have the luxury of normal development time. He'd already sold the car to the public. He'd already taken their money. By early 1948, Senator Homer Ferguson was actively working to destroy Tucker. Ferguson had connections to the Securities and Exchange Commission through his friend Harry MacDonald. Ferguson pushed MacDonald to investigate Tucker more aggressively. Look into the stock sales. Look into the dealerships. Look into the accessories. Find something to charge him with. Ferguson also blocked Tucker's access to steel. The War Assets Administration had several steel mills for sale, and Tucker desperately needed vertical integration to control his supply chain and reduce costs. Every time Tucker bid on a facility, Ferguson intervened, used his Senate influence to make sure those mills went to anyone except Tucker. The official line was that Tucker was inexperienced and would waste national resources. The real reason was that an independent steel supply would make Tucker impossible to control. The Big Three relied on supplier networks to maintain their monopoly. If Tucker could make his own steel, cut his own parts, control his own supply chain, he might actually succeed. And that terrified Detroit. So the trap was being set. Tucker had taken money from 44,000 investors. He'd sold accessories for cars that didn't exist. He'd made promises he couldn't keep. And the most powerful people in America were compiling evidence to bury him. Not because he was a fraud, but because he might actually be legitimate. Against all odds, Tucker started actual production in 1948. Not the mass production he'd promised, but real cars coming off a real assembly line. The first production, Tucker 48, rolled out of the Chicago plant in June of 1948, roughly a year after the Tin Goose disaster. It was beautiful. All the fundamental design elements had survived. The rear-mounted engine, the center headlight, the futuristic styling. But it was also practical. The engineers had solved most of the major problems. The transmission worked. The suspension held. The engine ran reliably, though it was still louder than conventional cars. The specs were impressive for 1948. 0 to 60 miles per hour in 10 seconds when most cars took 20. Top speed of 120 miles per hour when most cars topped out at 80. Fuel economy of 20 miles per gallon when most cars got 12. And those safety features were revolutionary. The padded dashboard alone probably would have saved thousands of lives per year if it had become standard. But production was painfully slow. Tucker had promised mass production, thousands of cars per month. The reality was maybe 1 or 2 per day if everything went perfectly. This wasn't Tucker's fault entirely. Remember, he couldn't get parts from regular suppliers because the Big Three had blacklisted him. He had to manufacture components in-house or source them from small suppliers who were willing to risk losing Big Three contracts. By August 1948, Tucker had built maybe 15 cars, total. After raising millions in investment, after hiring nearly 2,000 workers, After leasing a massive factory, he had 15 completed automobiles. The investors were getting nervous. The dealers who'd paid for franchises were getting angry. And the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation was heating up. Then came the Drew Pearson broadcast. Drew Pearson was one of the most influential journalists in America. His syndicated radio show, Washington Merry-Go-Round, reached millions of listeners. On June 6, 1948, Pearson dedicated his entire show to Tucker. And it wasn't a puff piece. Pearson called Tucker a fraud, said the whole operation was a scam designed to bilk innocent investors, claimed Tucker never intended to build cars, just sell stock and pocket the money. Pearson's exact words were that the upcoming SEC investigation would blow Tucker higher than a kite. Now, where did Pearson get his information? From inside the SEC investigation, someone leaked him confidential details from an investigation that was still ongoing. This is ethically questionable at best, possibly illegal. But Pearson had connections, and someone in the government wanted Tucker destroyed in the court of public opinion before any trial began. The effect was immediate and devastating. Tucker stock crashed. Investors panicked. Dealers demanded refunds on their franchises. Banks that had been considering loans suddenly went cold. Suppliers who'd been willing to risk the Big Three's anger now backed out completely. Pearson's broadcast did more damage to Tucker Corporation than all of Detroit's previous sabotage combined. Tucker fought back the only way he knew how, by building more cars. If he could show production ramping up, if he could demonstrate that this was a legitimate automobile company producing real vehicles, maybe he could salvage the situation. His engineers worked 16-hour shifts. Some slept in the factory. They built cars as fast as humanly possible, with limited parts and constant obstacles. By the end of 1948, Tucker Corporation had built 37 cars. Not the thousands he'd promised, but 37 real, functioning, revolutionary automobiles. People who drove them raved about the performance. Car magazines called them the most advanced cars in America. But it wasn't enough. The SEC investigation was nearly complete. Senator Ferguson was pushing for criminal charges. And inside Tucker Corporation, people were starting to panic. Some of Tucker's business associates began distancing themselves. Lawyers advised him to prepare for indictment. The writing was on the wall. On March 3, 1949, the SEC shut down all production at Tucker Corporation pending investigation results. 1,900 workers were laid off. The factory went silent, and Preston Tucker's dream of challenging Detroit died with a whimper, not a bang. June 10, 1949. Preston Tucker and 7 associates were indicted on 31 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and securities violations. The indictment was damning. It alleged that Tucker had never intended to build a car, that the whole operation was a sophisticated scheme to defraud investors, that the accessories program was particularly egregious because Tucker sold products for cars he knew would never be manufactured. The co-defendants were an interesting group. Harold Karsten, 58 years old, went by the alias Abe Karatz. He was Tucker's business associate and financial advisor. Floyd Cerf, 61, had handled the stock offerings. Mitchell Doolian, 50, was Tucker sales manager. Otis Radford, 42, was the comptroller. Cliff Noble, 42, ran advertising. Robert Pierce, 63, and Fred Rockelman, 64, were corporate executives. 7 men, all facing serious prison time. If convicted, Tucker could get decades in federal prison. His associates faced similar sentences, and the government had a strong case, at least on paper. The prosecution argued that Tucker had engaged in a pattern of deception, sold dealerships before having a prototype, sold stock before having a working car, sold accessories for cars that didn't exist, used money from new investors to pay old debts, classic pyramid scheme behavior, made promises he knew he couldn't keep about production timelines and vehicle specifications. The defense countered that Tucker had genuinely tried to build a revolutionary car, that every promise had been made in good faith, that delays and problems were normal in automotive development, that the Big Three had sabotaged Tucker through supplier pressure and political interference, that the accessories were real products, and anyone who bought them received what they paid for. The trial started in October 1949. It lasted months, hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of documentation. Engineers testified about the technical challenges of the Tucker 48. Investors testified about whether they felt defrauded. Business associates testified about Tucker's intentions and business practices. The prosecution brought in automotive experts who said the Tucker design was fundamentally flawed and could never have been mass-produced profitably. The defense brought in different experts who said the Tucker was the most advanced car in America, and the production problems were entirely due to external sabotage. What emerged during the trial was a picture of a man who was genuinely trying to build a revolutionary car, but who was also willing to cut legal and ethical corners to keep the dream alive. Tucker had oversold the car's readiness. He'd used accounting methods that were questionable. He'd made promises to investors that he couldn't guarantee. But here's the thing. Was that fraud? Or was that just business in post-war America? Ford had made similar promises about production that they didn't meet. General Motors had engaged in stock manipulation that would have been illegal under modern rules. The question wasn't whether Tucker bent rules. The question was whether he did it with criminal intent to defraud, or whether he was just a desperate entrepreneur trying to survive in a rigged game. The jury heard something else during the trial. Evidence of the conspiracy against Tucker. Letters from suppliers explaining that they couldn't sell to Tucker because the Big Three would retaliate. Testimony about Senator Ferguson's interference with War Assets Administration sales. Documentation of the leaked SEC information to Drew Pearson. The defense painted a picture of a coordinated campaign to destroy Tucker before he could threaten Detroit's monopoly. 300 workers showed up to testify as character witnesses. These were people who'd been laid off when the SEC shut down production. People who had no reason to support Tucker except that they believed in him. They testified that Tucker was trying to build a real car, that the factory was legitimate, that if they'd just been left alone, they could have made it work. On January 22nd, 1950, after months of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty, on all counts, for all defendants. The jury didn't just acquit Tucker on technicalities. They completely rejected the government's case, found that Tucker had not committed fraud, had not conspired to defraud investors, had genuinely tried to build a revolutionary automobile. Preston Tucker walked out of that courthouse a free man, vindicated, proven innocent. The judge had agreed with his lawyers that the charges were baseless, that the government had overreached, that this had been more about protecting Detroit's interests than about prosecuting actual fraud. Tucker gave a statement to reporters. He was optimistic, energetic, the same old Preston Tucker. He said the acquittal proved he'd been right all along, that the Tucker 48 was a legitimate vehicle that deserved to be on American roads, that he was going to restart production and prove the doubters wrong. He referenced Henry Ford, who'd also failed with his first company before founding Ford Motor Company and becoming one of the richest men in America. Tucker said, "Even Henry Ford failed the first time out. This is just the beginning for Tucker Corporation." But it was over. The trial had lasted so long that the momentum was gone. The investors who'd stuck with Tucker through the investigation had mostly pulled out after the indictment. The dealers who'd bought franchises had moved on to selling Fords and Chevrolets. The factory lease had expired. The specialized machinery had been sold for scrap. Most devastating, public confidence was destroyed. It didn't matter that Tucker had been acquitted. The damage from Drew Pearson's broadcast, from the SEC investigation, from months of negative headlines that couldn't be undone. Tucker the car was revolutionary. Tucker the man was tainted. Those 51 cars that had been built, they became collector's items almost immediately. People who owned Tucker 48s held onto them, but nobody was buying new stock in Tucker Corporation. No bank would loan him money. No supplier would sell him parts. Senator Ferguson had won, even though Tucker had been proven innocent in court. Tucker tried. He really tried. He attempted to interest investors in restarting production. He pitched the Tucker to overseas markets. He worked on designs for a smaller, more economical Tucker for the Brazilian market. That's actually where Tucker was when he got sick. In Brazil, still chasing the dream, still convinced he could make it work. The lung cancer diagnosis came after he returned from Brazil in 1956. He'd been a heavy smoker, which was common for that era, and the stress of the previous decade had probably destroyed his health. Lung cancer in 1956 was a death sentence. No effective treatments, no chemotherapy like we have now, just pain management and watching the calendar. Tucker died on December 26, 1956, the day after Christmas. He was 53 years old. His wife Vera was with him. His children were there. The man who'd tried to revolutionize the American automobile industry died in relative obscurity in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The newspapers that covered his death mostly framed it as the end of a cautionary tale. The man who dreamed too big, promised too much, crashed and burned. They mentioned the trial, the acquittal, but always with an asterisk that suggested maybe the jury had gotten it wrong. The story became, Tucker was a con man who got lucky in court, not an innovator who got crushed by a conspiracy. But those 51 cars, they survived. And as the decades passed, their value skyrocketed. By the 1980s, Tucker automobiles were selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the 2000s, over $1 million. Today, a Tucker in good condition sells for $3 to $4 million. That's more than most Ferraris, more than classic Porsches, more than nearly any other American car from the 1940s. Why? Because people who drive them, who study them, who understand automotive engineering, recognize something important. Tucker was right. The Tucker 48 was decades ahead of its time. The safety features would have saved countless lives. The engineering innovations influenced car design for the next 50 years. The rear-mounted engine, the independent suspension, the attention to crash safety, all of that became standard eventually. And here's the most damning evidence that Tucker was crushed by conspiracy, not failure. Every single one of his revolutionary features eventually became standard in the automotive industry. Disc brakes, fuel injection, crumple zones, padded dashboards, center-mounted brake lights, independent suspension. If Tucker's ideas were worthless, why did every car manufacturer eventually adopt them? Let's talk about what happened to the people who destroyed Tucker, because that story is almost more interesting than Tucker's own fate. Senator Homer Ferguson served in the United States Senate until 1955. He lost his re-election bid that year, partially due to accusations that he'd been too cozy with automotive interests during the Tucker affair. After leaving the Senate, Ferguson became a judge on the United States Military Court of Appeals. He lived until 1982, dying at age 93, never publicly acknowledging his role in Tucker's destruction. Harry McDonald, the SEC commissioner who initiated the investigation and leaked details to Drew Pearson, continued his career in government. There were never any consequences for his ethical violations. The leak was never officially investigated. McDonald retired with full benefits and a pension. Drew Pearson continued his journalism career. The Washington merry-go-round remained popular until his death in 1969. He never retracted his Tucker broadcast, never apologized for the demonstrably false claims he'd made. In his autobiography, he mentioned Tucker exactly once, in passing, still implying that Tucker had been a fraud despite the acquittal. The big three automakers. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler went on to dominate the American automotive market for another 40 years. They continued building the same basic designs with minor cosmetic changes year over year. Safety features were added only when forced by government regulation in the 1960s and 70s. Here's the dark irony. Detroit fought Tucker because his safety features would have cost money and cut into profits. But in the 1970s, Ralph Nader and the consumer safety movement forced the industry to adopt those same features anyway. Padded dashboards became mandatory. Safety glass became mandatory. Better crash structures became mandatory. The big three spent billions fighting regulation and eventually had to implement Tucker's ideas anyway, just decades later, after thousands of unnecessary deaths. Alex Tremulous, Tucker's chief designer, who created the 48 in 6 days, went on to work for Ford. He designed the Ford Mystere show car in the 50s and had a successful career in automotive design. In interviews later in life, Tremulous always said that designing the Tucker was the proudest moment of his career. Not because the car succeeded, but because it proved what was possible when engineers weren't constrained by corporate committees and profit margins. The 7 men indicted alongside Tucker had mixed fates. Some continued in business. Others faded into obscurity. Harold Karsten, the Abe Karatz with the alias, went back to private business and stayed out of the public eye. Floyd Cerf retired. The trial had been traumatic for all of them, and most chose to move on quietly rather than fight to clear their names publicly. The 300 workers who testified as character witnesses? Most went to work for Ford or General Motors. They had families to feed, bills to pay. The dream of Tucker Corporation was beautiful, but it didn't pay mortgages. Some of them kept their Tucker pay stubs as souvenirs, proud that they'd been part of something revolutionary, even if it failed. The 44,000 investors lost most of their money. Tucker Corporation stock became worthless after the company folded. Some investors tried to sue for recovery, but there was nothing to recover. The company assets had been liquidated to pay legal fees and debts. A few investors held on to their stock certificates as reminders. Today, those worthless stock certificates sell for hundreds of dollars to collectors. The Tucker automobiles themselves became legendary. Movie stars bought them. Car collectors hunted them obsessively. When Francis Ford Coppola made the film Tucker, the Man and His Dream in 1988, it introduced Tucker's story to a new generation. Jeff Bridges played Preston Tucker as a tragic hero, which was probably more accurate than the con man narrative that had dominated for decades. Modern historians who've studied the Tucker case almost universally conclude that he was crushed by a conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. Supplier pressure from the Big Three, political interference from Senator Ferguson, coordinated media attacks, selective enforcement of securities regulations. Tucker wasn't perfect, and he did cut corners, but he was targeted for destruction in a way that no other automotive startup ever was. And here's the final mystery that still haunts automotive history. What if Tucker had succeeded? What if those safety features had become standard in 1948 instead of the 1970s? How many lives would have been saved? How different would American automotive design be today? We'll never know, because the people who could have answered those questions made sure Tucker never got the chance. When you look at Preston Tucker's story through the lens of modern business, the parallels are striking and a little terrifying. Consider Tesla. When Elon Musk announced he was building an electric car company in the early 2000s, the automotive industry laughed. Electric cars had been tried dozens of times and always failed. The technology wasn't ready. The infrastructure didn't exist. Customers wouldn't buy them. But Musk pushed forward, and the established automakers responded exactly like the Big Three responded to Tucker. They tried to block Tesla's access to dealerships, lobbied states to pass laws preventing direct-to-consumer car sales, spread FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about electric vehicle range and reliability, used their political connections to deny Tesla the same subsidies and benefits they enjoyed. And just like Tucker, Musk faced government investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged him with fraud over tweets about taking Tesla private. He was forced to step down as chairman. The company faced constant scrutiny that established automakers never experienced. Sound familiar? Sound. The difference is that Musk had resources. Tucker never had. Billions in personal wealth. A government that was slightly more open to disruptive innovation than 1940s America. And most importantly, the internet, which made it impossible for traditional media to control the narrative the way Drew Pearson controlled Tucker's story. Or look at Airbnb and Uber. Both companies tried to disrupt established industries, hotels and taxis, and both faced coordinated campaigns of regulatory warfare designed to destroy them. Cities banned them. Industries lobbied against them. Governments investigated them. The tactics were nearly identical to what Tucker faced. Use regulation as a weapon to protect incumbents from innovative competitors. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Established industries don't compete with disruptors through better products or services. They use political connections, regulatory capture, and media manipulation to crush threats before they can mature. It worked on Tucker in the 1940s. It's still being tried on innovative companies today. Preston Tucker's technical innovations have all become standard. Rear-mounted engines are common in sports cars. Independent suspension is universal. Disc brakes replaced drums. Fuel injection replaced carburetors. Crumple zones and safety glass are legally mandated. Even the center Cyclops eye headlight, illegal in 17 states when Tucker proposed it, is now cutting-edge adaptive lighting technology in luxury vehicles. If you drive a modern car, you're driving with Tucker innovations. The padded dashboard, the safety glass, the attention to crash protection. These weren't industry standards until decades after Tucker proposed them, but they're his legacy nonetheless. The 51 Tucker automobiles that survive are more than just collectibles. They're proof that what the establishment called impossible was actually achievable. That safety and innovation weren't too expensive. They just threatened profit margins. That one man with a dream and 300 loyal workers could build something better than the largest corporations in the world. There's a Tucker in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. It sits there as a testament to American innovation and American industrial conspiracy. The plaque describes Preston Tucker's vision and his destruction. It doesn't use the word conspiracy, because museums are diplomatic, but the facts speak for themselves. What should we take from Tucker's story? Maybe that innovation is always threatening to established interests, that the free market isn't actually free when incumbents can rig the game through regulation and political connections, that sometimes being proven right isn't enough if you're destroyed before you can prove it. But also this, that dreams matter, even failed ones. Those 300 workers who came back without pay to finish the final 14 cars after the SEC shut down, they weren't idiots. They knew the company was dead. They came back because they believed in what they'd built, because finishing those cars meant something beyond profit and loss. Preston Tucker died believing he'd failed. His last words to his wife were reportedly about the car, about wishing he'd had more time to get it right. But he didn't fail. He built something revolutionary. He challenged an entire industry. He proved that safety was possible, that innovation was achievable, that the establishment could be fought, even if you ultimately lost. Today, automotive engineers study the Tucker 48, not as a failure, but as a success that was sabotaged. Business schools teach the Tucker case as an example of how monopolies crush competition through regulatory capture rather than innovation. And car collectors pay millions for a vehicle that supposedly nobody wanted. The question isn't whether Preston Tucker built a better car. He did, and history has proven that. The question is whether we've learned anything from his destruction. Do we still allow established industries to use government power to crush innovative competitors? Do we still let political connections matter more than better products? Do we still sacrifice innovation to protect incumbents? So, what do you think? Was Preston Tucker a visionary crushed by conspiracy, or a con man who got lucky in court? Do you use any of Tucker's innovations in your car today? Let me know in the comments what innovative company you think is facing the same kind of establishment resistance that Tucker faced. Hit that like button if you learned something new about automotive history. And subscribe for more stories about the geniuses and dreamers who tried to change the world and paid the price for it. Those 51 Tucker automobiles are still out there, still running, still proof that one man's impossible dream was actually achievable. And somewhere, Preston Tucker is probably smiling about that.